So thank you all for coming this evening. I'm Bruce McConnell, as you know, and I'm based in San Francisco, although the weather is much better today here than it is in San Francisco, so I'm moving back, I tell you. As you all know, EastWest Institute is an independent NGO with a 36-year history of reducing international conflict, addressing seemingly intractable problems that threaten world security and stability. Today's event is the latest accomplishment of our 8-year-old cybersecurity program, which began as an effort to reduce repair times for undersea cables that hold the world together electronically. I will not waste any of your time this evening with the obligatory recitation of the security threat in cyberspace. But fortunately, governments and corporations are responding to protect themselves from malicious actors outside and inside their organizations. There's a lot of guidance out there on how to mitigate operational security risk, which many of you are also familiar with. The book we will tell you about tonight fills a gap in that guidance. This is a management guide designed to help start conversations between technology buyers and suppliers about product and service cybersecurity. We all rely on these commercial products and services, but we have no reliable way to know how secure they are. There is no underwriter's laboratory for ICT products and services, and given how fast the technology evolves, the 18-month product cycle, there may never be one. Until recently, of course, most buyers wanted only price and feature. They were unwilling to pay for security. Now that is changing. Now buyers need a way to communicate this additional priority to suppliers. We believe that buyers communicating their security requirements in an objective manner will not only increase their organization's cybersecurity, it will incentivize ICT suppliers to develop and provide more secure ICT products and services. Our EastWest Institute Breakthrough Group leaders, who I will introduce to you in just a moment, produced this work as a team, but we also had help. We received feedback at various stages and drafts from experts from around the world and across government and industry, including the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology, the White House, the Data Security Council of India, and our sponsor, Unisys Corporation and CenturyLink, and companies in the financial services, telecommunications, and retail sectors. So our Breakthrough Group leaders will now take a few minutes to walk you through the high points of the guide. We will begin with Andy Purdy, Chief Security Officer of Huawei Technologies. Andy will be followed by Sally Long, the Director of the Open Group Trusted Technology Forum, Angela McKay, Director of Cybersecurity Policy and Strategy at Microsoft, will bat cleanup, after which I'll say a few words about next steps before turning it over to all of you. Andy?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to finally be able to release this buyer security guide that we've been working together on for quite some time. And I think Bruce gave an excellent summary of what we're trying to accomplish. There's been an increasing recognition that with the threat out there that there really needs to be comprehensive approaches to the risk, and that it's not just a question of an organization looking at itself. Organizations have to be aware of who they buy from and start to have the kinds of conversations to make sure they are really considering the risk from the products and services that they buy. So the kinds of things that an organization needs to do to be effective in managing risk have to be part of the conversations with the suppliers and the providers to make sure they were doing similar kinds of things. So we have laid out, and we have 3 subparts to the section on enterprise security governance. The first part of strategy control, that organizations need to have a commitment and an organizational structure that allows them to understand and manage the risk across the board that they face internally. Those who buy have to be able to evaluate that from the perspective of the suppliers and the providers. Those organizations need a commitment. They need to have an organization-wide capability made up of all the key players whose activities and work affects the risk that they may, in effect, transfer on to their customers. And the organization itself, its leaders, need to own the risk. And the key parts have to have some kind of a cross-organizational governance mechanism so that there can be an understanding of where the risk posture is, where it needs to go, and how well it's moving forward. And that information needs to be easily communicated so it's visible to the leaders of the organization, the boards of directors, or however the leadership of the organization is set up. Now, the organization also needs, and again, it's organizations generally, but the suppliers and providers, and so this is part of the conversation. Does the supplier have requirements that they have built in to what they do, so that the different components of that organization that contribute to the product or service that's going to be conveyed, that they have to have those real requirements? There's a lot of discussion in cybersecurity circles about compliance, and it's sort of, compliance is sort of a bad word because people are thinking, well, there's external compliance, you check the box, and that's not about really managing risk, which is what it's about. But when you look at an organization such as a supplier, the organization needs to have internal requirements, and they need to have capabilities in place so they can evaluate whether and to what extent those requirements are being met. And so the concept of separation of duties that is very prevalent in information security, the folks that are attempting to meet the requirements have to be different from the individuals who are assessing whether or not those requirements are being met, which is why there needs to be sort of an internal compliance effort and there needs to be internal auditing. Now, one of the things that we emphasize here is that you can have, and you probably need to have, many organizations need sort of a crawl, walk, run philosophy. So we have tried to lay out for each of these sections, including the three here, questions related to each of these that an organization can ask of or require from their vendors and suppliers. So they could start out asking questions so they can learn. Then they could get to the point that they could give preference for a particular of those aspects and the answers to those questions, or they can make them mandatory. So the second area is standards and processes. So we think it's important for suppliers and providers to identify those standards and best practices that are most important, that are most associated with the effective delivery of risk management and risk mitigation. And hopefully, those are steeped in internationally recognized standards and best practices. And that these standards ought to be part of the components and requirements that we talked about a moment ago. Fundamentally, an organization needs to know what they need to worry about and what they need to do about it. And increasingly, organizations globally are using the NIST cybersecurity framework to assess their risk. And the idea of using those tools to assess the risk from your suppliers and your providers is one that's worth considering. The NIST cybersecurity framework is expected to have a supplement going forward that would build in supply chain risk in a clearer kind of a way. As we move to human resources, there's a lot of discussion in cybersecurity about people being the weakest link. I think it's important that organizations have to create a culture for security and privacy. And you have to have the traditional awareness, you have to have the traditional testing. But that's not enough. We saw recently a story, I think it was based in New York actually, of a major news organization that had a real problem with sexual harassment. And one of the things where cybersecurity is similar to sexual harassment, I think, is that you not only train and give guidance as to what kinds of things are acceptable and not acceptable, but you have to build a culture and a capability that makes it understood that it's not just enough to talk about these things. You have to have mechanisms in place that you can encourage people to report, sometimes anonymously, and you're going to hold people accountable for their conduct. Because you have to make clear in that culture, if you want people to report wrongdoing, you have to make clear that your organization is committed to those standards. There are also various techniques that a company can do or an organization can do for random compliance evaluations. So one of the questions that we pose in the guide related to this category of human resources is, how are key personnel vetted, selected, trained, and held accountable for trustworthiness? So when there's organizations that new to evaluating your providers could start by asking those kinds of questions of the people, of the organizations that they're considering buying from. And I think that can start having the effect of incentivizing organizations to be able to answer these kinds of questions in a way that's meaningful and provable.
So I'm going to talk about the product and service lifecycle. And this is a really important piece because what buyers need to start doing, and I know many buyers do it correctly, but there's a whole different level of buyer in the world today. And everybody uses COTS ICT or ICT without the COTS. They are in every one of our commercial environments, our governments, our critical infrastructure, and in fact in our homes. So the buyers need to increase their awareness of what they should ask of and demand of their providers. And so that's what this section is really about, trying to facilitate awareness with the buyers so that they can have the proper and effective dialogue with their providers in terms of the best practices that they follow throughout the full life cycle, from design through maintenance and, in fact, even through disposal. It used to be that there were standards out there for product security. Now, industry is moving away from that a bit, and rightly so, because what we have to do is make sure that the product is developed consistently, mitigating the risks of taint and counterfeit, mitigating the risk of cyber and supply chain security every time they build the product. And so this section really talks about what questions a buyer might ask of their provider to see if they are thinking about mitigating that risk, and if they are managing that products in a way that does mitigate the risk of taint and counterfeit, which of course leads to malware and destruction and stealing and things like that. So what we've done here is we've kind of broken it down, the product life cycle, into different areas. And we chose to do a certain model. You can see in the guide. It really is about design and development, build, release, fulfillment, sustainment, response, source, and supply chain. Now, when we chose this model, but everybody has their own model, but they're all conceptually the same, is that it's a life cycle. So in talking about development and design, the important piece there is really that you build security into your systems, from design to software development and hardware development, which is, one of the things that we might expand on in the next version. But that you build security in from the beginning. So we've broken it down into software development, and that is really the basic hygiene practices that every developer should be following: quality assurance, configuration management, those basic elements. Next is secure methodologies, and that is the part where you're talking about threat analysis and coding so that you prevent vulnerabilities, et cetera. The next category we have is building. And this is important because that includes assemble and manufacturing and integrating it. So the way providers really work now, and these products are built from components all over the world, and so that global aspect is something that we try and get a handle on by following the best practices consistently all the time. So ICT providers typically outsource, many of them, more than 75% of their components. So when you consider that, this build phase is extremely important, that they're following best practice so that the components that come in and they reintegrate them and they build a product out of it and then distribute it, that those aren't tainted or counterfeit components. So this section provides some questions that a buyer might ask to make sure that they're aware of it, that their providers are aware of it. The other area is release, fulfillment, and distribution. And this area really is about the channel partners, because when you look at supply chain, you have to, in building products, you have to consider OEMs, ODMs, hardware and software component suppliers, and your distribution channels, right? Your value-add resellers, your regular old distributors, so that while they're doing their piece of the puzzle, they're mitigating the risks of tampering all along the way. So again, for each of those sections, we have some questions that Huawei has provided in 100 questions. I think all of them are detailed in Appendix C, I believe. And so we've taken some questions from each of those and put them in the different sections to start the dialogue. The other area is sustainment and response. And this is particularly important from a cybersecurity aspect when you talk about patching, whether it's functional patching, but most importantly, security patching. And so the provider needs to make sure that their buyer understands the commitment for those things, and the buyer can influence the provider in terms of, incident response and making sure that any known vulnerabilities are fixed and things like that. So those are the types of questions we have in that section. And then sustainment, I just did sustainment and response. So outsourcing and supply chain. Again, this is huge, and in our diagram, we actually have a line under all of those other phases that I just talked about, because many ICT providers consider that all of those phases are really part of the supply chain in today's world, because so much is outsourced. And so it's very important that many buyers realize this, but this guide is to help them become more aware so that they can more effectively dialogue with their buyers. Not only with these questions that we have, but also asking about international standards, as Andy had mentioned, because some of the international standards that are out there do cover supply chain and cybersecurity, like ISO IEC 20243, which is mitigating the risks of tainted and counterfeit products. And that's not the only standard that deals with security. There's many more, including the NIST cybersecurity framework that looks at it from a little bit more of an operational perspective. But in Appendix B of the guide are referenced all of the different many of the different standards that would be applicable, so that when buyers are actually talking to their providers, asking whether they're conformant to a certain standard always offers more assurance than one by one asking them questions, because it covers more of the requirements. But I'm not going to talk about assurance, because my colleague, Angela McKay from Microsoft, will now talk about that.
Thanks. Thanks, Sally. So what you've really heard, hopefully across both Andy and Sally, is ultimately this guide is intended to drive a conversation between buyers and suppliers about what suppliers are doing with regards to how they manage their cybersecurity risk across their organization, as well as how they manage cybersecurity inside of the production and management of technology over time. Well, so conversations are great, and that's exactly what we want to drive. But when I talk with business leaders, and we have customers who come to Microsoft, conversation is only going to go so far. Ultimately, they're going to want to understand how you translate conversations into commitments. And then ultimately, how one demonstrates that one is delivering against the commitments that have been made. And so ultimately, that's what the section on driving assurance or creating assurance is about. We really broke it down into the two component areas. First of all, how do you foster this type of assurance? And then how do you demonstrate it? I think about the fostering as the translation of the conversation into commitments. And we outline basically 3 ways that one can think about actually creating commitments. The first is the one that comes to mind, I think, most naturally by a lot of people. We should have regulation in this space. Because, it is a very important conversation. That is the least voluntary, the most mandatory version. And as we look around the world, there is not a huge volume of regulatory law in this space right now. You do have some requirements, in particular from governments who deal with greater geopolitical concerns. So for example, in the US, you have the Federal Acquisition Regulation and some of the defense federal regulation that focuses on what are suppliers doing to manage security in how they produce and manage technology over time. You also have some similar requirements out of China in the multi-level protection scheme. They really look to, again, how is that technology made? But right now, there is not a huge corpus of law or regulation in this space. What we definitely see a lot more of is the use of contracts to have conversations between suppliers and buyers around what organizations are doing to manage security across the life cycle of the products and services. I see this came up a huge amount for Microsoft about 10 years ago, when the financial services sector was like, you know what, we are worried and not certain about what you are doing to improve the assurance of your code. How are you doing many of the things that Sally was actually talking about? And at that time, what our major financial services customers did, and this is a great example of the marketplace driving behavioral change in cybersecurity, is they said, we're going to put requirements in our contracts. You, Microsoft, and other technology vendors, you're going to have to do some things to demonstrate, to commit that you are doing security in the development of technology, and then to demonstrate it as well. And so definitely have seen a lot of work over time to integrate that into contracts. And I think many of the questions you would see in the conclusion of this document, the 25 questions that we use to facilitate the conversation, can be helpful in thinking about what may need to go into a contract. The thing that I think a lot of people actually miss in the conversation on fostering assurance is what vendors can do voluntarily without any kind of particular requirement from a customer or from a regulator, but actually saying, you know what, I'm trying to voluntarily demonstrate and show some of the things that I'm doing in this space. And we characterize that as how to use transparency to help create greater assurance. And there are some things that both Microsoft and Huawei and a few other vendors actually do in this space. Things like, we may have a requirement from a customer on how we manage the secure development lifecycle, but we will also then be willing to show them documentation about how we do that. Another example that both Microsoft and Huawei participate in is having these centers where either governments or customers, based on a series of requirements, can actually come and look at the code base and review it and see whether or not they can run tools against it and see whether or not there are any concerns that need to be addressed. Those are voluntary, self-initiated activities whereby we're trying to drive additional transparency. So out of the conversation on secure ICT, one of the other places you would have seen a lot on using transparency has to do with law enforcement access requests and intelligence requests, things like transparency reports. But again, I just like to highlight, when you think about the range of voluntary and involuntary ways to create requirements on suppliers, it's not just the side of government regulation. There's also a contractual space and a space around transparency. Maybe one other thing before I move on to demonstrating is something that oftentimes gets missed in talking about the regulatory and contractual landscape is when suppliers and buyers are talking about regulation, they do need to talk about what applies to each one of them. So for example, let's say that, as we operate on a global basis, so let's say we're operating in Germany and I have a customer who is sitting in Taiwan. We were just talking about Taiwan up here earlier. But the customer, we need to understand what requirements, regulatory requirements, the customer may be experiencing. So for example, the communications network provider in Thailand, what kind of regulatory requirements they may have around that are applied from the regulator to them. And then they also need to know what has been applied to Microsoft directly. It's the intersection of that regulatory environment of what applies to the supplier and what applies to the buyer that helps you understand what you may want to then address additionally in contracts. So that's one of those pieces that I think oftentimes gets a little lost is from a technology provider point of view, we have rolled down requirements for customer sets. And it's important not only to know what's going to apply to us directly, but how to help our customer meet the demands that are put on them. So in demonstrating, this is ultimately what information is either disclosed or what kind of evidence can be shared to demonstrate behavior consistent with the commitment that's been made. So there are two different types that we've outlined. There's external attestation and self-attestation. And again, in the context of external attestation, people usually go to one of two lenses. They either say, oh, the government regulator is here, and I have shown them the paperwork, or they have gone into the operations, they've seen the building, and that is the way we have demonstrated external attestation. The other one that most people think about is a third-party auditor, someone like one of the big four that comes in and does an audit or assessment. But there's actually a very large range, particularly relative to the conversation on improving assurance. So there are government regulators, there are also third-party auditors, but in addition, there are testing labs where products can go and be tested whether or not they are following certain practices. There's also intra-industry exchange whereby you can have a peer external attestation of each other's processes. That's one of the things that oftentimes works well, I think, in the technology world, because it can be sometimes difficult for government regulators to have the same level of expertise in how technology is built as maybe a peer in the community might have. The thing that is talked about most often right there is really certifications. And there are, as Sally noted, a series of international standards that exist around secure ICT products and services. Some of those have certifications. So for example, the Open Group's Trusted Technology Standard, which is number 20243, does have a certification against it. But there are also areas and international standards that don't yet have certifications against them. Two of those that come to mind really easily are ISO 27034, which is a process-oriented standard towards improving software development across the life cycle, and then 27036 that focuses specifically on supply chain security. So those are spaces when there's not a certification process where vendors then may self-attest to the fact that they are doing something. This can take a variety of forms, everything from an executive saying, we follow 27034, to writing it again in a contract where we commit and self-attest that while there may not yet be a third-party audit, you can use an overall commitment to help demonstrate assurance in this space. I think one of the last things I'd like to say on this one is, as you're thinking again about this conversation between buyers and suppliers, it is very important to start the conversation on what are the international standards that are important to both the supplier and the buyer in this conversation, and then to use those international standards as a basis of the way to kind of drive what are the other commitments that may not already be covered that are of interest to the buyer. So again, you can think about it as international standards can provide a base, and that base may be enough, but it may be in some scenarios where you have higher risk customers, they may actually be interested in things on top of the base that exist in international standards. So just kind of important to understand what is the consistent requirement versus where there may be uniquenesses that can be addressed, for example, through contracts and through self-attestation. So I think that is about it for the conversation on creating assurance, and I'm going to hand it back over to Bruce.
Great, thank you so much, Angela and Sally and Andy. We've been working very close together, and I'm sure we will continue to do so in the months ahead. As you've heard, the guide is structured into these three parts about governance, about the kind of manufacturing product lifecycle, and about assurance. In each of those places, we come up with a set of questions. Some of them, many of them are adapted from the longer list that is in Appendix C that Huawei came up with originally, but they're focused, they're a little bit more focused. So there's 25 questions which are laid out in here at the back of the main text, really provide kind of the basis for those kinds of conversations. This guide is a first step to fill in this gap in the guidance for cybersecurity, cyberspace security for governments and organizations. And as such, it's kind of a compromise. As you'll read it, you'll see that it's really not a checklist. It's written both to senior management as a risk management guide to kind of raise awareness among senior managers that, oh, we need to think about the stuff we're bringing in and running our business on, and how do we know that that's secure? How do we, and at the same time, help the technology people in the companies and in governments begin to make sure they're covering all the things that they should be covering when they talk to their vendors. So it's our hope that organizations like National Institute of Standards and Technology or the Data Security Council of India will take this document on to the next level of detail and create more kind of handbook type things. But meanwhile, we're going to continue to solicit feedback starting tonight from you and report on what we've learned, what we learned at our next Global Cyberspace Cooperation Summit, which is now scheduled for March 14th through 16th next year at the University of California, Berkeley. And while I'm giving a plug here, I'll say that at that summit we will also discuss our work in our other volunteer breakthrough groups, including securing the Internet of Things, balancing encryption and lawful access to data on a global basis, developing cyberspace norms of behavior, and strengthening the resilience of critical infrastructure. So at this point, I'd like to turn the floor over to all of you for comments and questions. You might tell us what you think we've left out that we should add if there's another version, and what should we do next about this. So the floor is open. Thank you. John.
When you started, did you start with the assumption that all of the participants were good actors?
All of the participants
Good
in
actors. In other
which
words,
participants? You mean the participants in the group?
vendors and developers. The vendors and developers were in fact.
We do ask part of the conversation, right, in both the first two sections is about are all the employees good actors within? Yeah.
I think you're asking is, do they take the position as an original sin, whether people begin as good, organizations begin as good organizations? And how do you perceive what are the other?
So I guess I would say a lot of what we focus on is not necessarily the country where an organization is based or the particular company, but rather focus on how technology is produced. So that's one of those conversations that has been that we've been seeking to drive for a while now. Sally, actually, you started to mention it, that it's a little bit less about where and who and a lot more about how. Now, I don't think that ignores the fact that there are, as I said earlier, places where there are geopolitical concerns that start to exacerbate some of those challenges. But nonetheless, I think it is the right conversation for us to continue to drive, to focus on the how and not the who as part of this.
You know, I didn't mean that a priori, like Huawei is bad or something like that. You know, it's been a wedge.
So, but I think it's
yeah. You know, I think it makes a difference how you look at it. You're starting from the assumption that the organization fully intends to provide the most secure thing they practically can.
Yeah, or whatever you're willing to pay for, right? So, but I think I think it's a good question, and I think it plays out a lot in the supply chain area. So, I mean, when we talk about having conversations, right? So, not every buyer can have a conversation with Microsoft about this in some detail, right? So, this has to start at the wholesale level, not in the smaller companies in some ways. But I think it's like. When you get into, a large supplier's supply chain, then you're pushing this due diligence down, and so you may find a bad apple in the smaller companies. So as to whether the larger geopolitical conversation is exactly right, there was some discussion of this in a Wall Street Journal article that ran this morning. And our view, I think, is that people should be able to access the most secure ICT products and services irrespective of where the supplier happens to be headquartered, because this stuff comes from everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, just add one other thing, because I think, a lot of what we've talked about focuses on the world in which we live today. So the experiences that we're talking about here, and even in the open group, Huawei and Microsoft, these are the best practices that are being practiced by large-scale technology providers, and we're working to drive a conversation. But the ecosystem is dramatically changing, right? So now you also have people who are producing technology who may not be technology companies. At the last EWI event, I remember it was almost like a caricature at the event where people were talking about the coffee machine and the Barbie, and Barbie carrying out these particular attacks, which is a very funny image in my head. But there was something there that's really important to remember. So what we talk about here is, again, a conversation. What's going to apply is not necessarily going to be the same in a large-scale technology company as in a company that is producing, let's say, appliances. But as we move into this world where there are IoT applications and mobile applications across all of the sectors, and you have all kinds of companies that are producing code, I think it does start to get into this idea of what's scalable to different environments as well. And so I think while that doesn't necessarily assume are good or bad, it may actually assume, what is the market drivers that may actually incentivize this behavior are going to look different in different places.
But that gets you into the question of sanctions.
Sanctions.
Doesn't that get you into the question of, as part of the conversation, I think needs to involve sanctions for non-compliance?
You mean like contract violations?
Contract violations.
Right.
Or
So,
regulation.
right, exactly, right, yeah. So not necessarily national economic sanctions, but accountability.
That's right.
Right, exactly, yeah. No, absolutely, that's right. I think in the market, obviously the preference is to let the market drive that as much as possible, but, yeah, exactly.
That's a conversation that I think is going on right now.
Yeah.
I think the beauty of the kind of thing we're talking about is, I think this is an alternative. In some cases, it may have to be a supplement because regulations are going to happen, but regulations in cyberspace are not universally viewed as a very positive thing. And given the nature of the threat environment, the evolving dynamic threat, the vulnerabilities that affect systems and networks and software all over the world, one shouldn't assume anything. One should not assume that a particular provider is good today because they were good yesterday. So the idea of doing the kinds of things that Angela and Bruce just mentioned, building in the contractual provisions, building in the requirements for both internal and external testing. And some of the internal could be you would provide as part of the contract, you would provide evidence that you did the testing. Because the dynamic nature of managing the risk is something that these kinds of conversations, these kinds of discussions can have a big impact on. And I would suggest building on some language in the document. We talk about buyers should also collaborate with like-minded buyers to leverage their collective purchasing power. So just as the kinds of things we're talking about will help an organization address its risk, that governments around the world need to work within their sectors and across sectors to bring folks together to try to get them to understand and to develop this crawl, walk, run, these questions, these dynamic requirements for what needs to happen in terms of what they're going to purchase from. Sometimes it might be product evaluation. I know the financial sector, for example, in the United States, has a lot of companies evaluating the same code. And so the idea of trying to have conversations, organize like-minded buyers so that you can dynamically address the risk in a systematic way over time and incentivize those who want to sell to them to raise the bar, because we as a global community are not incentivizing the raising of the bar of products and services adequately. Yes, some of the great companies of the world obviously want to sell and they make this a hallmark, but not enough buyers around the world are putting in the kinds of security requirements that are necessary to address risk.
The other thing I would like to add is that because it is a global world and because those components are made all over the world, everybody's product has components from everywhere. in it. And so if we can come up with criteria that is important and established for everyone, regardless of the locale or their corporate headquarters or their manufacturing facility, then I think we're taking a step in the right direction.
Thank you, John. Other comments, questions, observations, complaints? Go ahead.
Yeah,
Sure, sure.
but how do you see the role of the assurance arguments and assertions made by the vendor? You understand? So, I mean, it seemed to me if I am a somewhat savvy buyer, but I'm not, you know, a IT security expert, or I'm not a big enough corporation, or for whatever reason I don't have a robust enough security staff to develop what all the assurance arguments ought to be for this product that I'm buying. When you looked at it, did you look at how the seller might just put together the arguments and use, you know, rather than relying on the buyer, making it only the buyer? So I make an argument that not only does this thing, you know, if it's a flashlight, provide so many lumens, but it also doesn't have a lithium-ion battery that's going to blow up. You know, I tell you that up front, but a little bit more complicated. And just curious how you looked at.
I would just say, I think that this gets to the dynamic back and forth. Yeah, we definitely have customers who are not yet ready to have a high-level conversation. We think the guide will help. We think the guide will help. But at the same time, I think most technology vendors also do have a way of saying, here are some of the things that are typically asked of us outside of the regulatory construct. So, for example, things like I mentioned earlier, Microsoft has long been involved in the security development lifecycle. And so one of the things that we both have made a commitment to and deliver across all of our customers, regardless of whether or not it's in the contract, because it's baked into our products and services, are things like ISO 27034. But I think it is important, and I think, unless I'm mistaken, the guide actually has a series of some of those standards that may help. And maybe the other thing that's important here is we focus on the idea of a supplier-buyer conversation. But I actually would highlight that, John, you just brought up another conversation that I think needs to occur, which is the one between the technologist inside of an organization, the CIO, the CISO, and those business leaders in the C-suite who may be making investment decisions as well. There probably is a resident pool of expertise somewhere inside of a company or outsourced to a consultancy, but that conversation needs to occur.
And I would add that those conversations, I think, are aided when there has been discussion, say, within a sector of like-minded buyers, where they articulate certain requirements. So then there's a basis of comparison. So those internal folks who are lobbying for resources or meeting priorities can say, well, you know, this other competitor is doing it, so we've got to do it. Those competitive pressures, I think, can help drive a higher security level. And when you're talking about suppliers and providers, that discussion is not happening often enough, I don't think.
The other thing, John, I think one thing that we're just touching on a little bit in here is the risk-based application or assessment. So depending on that, yeah, maybe you do need a certified, you know, provider, but maybe you don't. Maybe you just need an assessment or a self-assessment. Or
Really, the question kind of is it migrating that way? Can it migrate that way? Would that be more effective than regulation?
But I think it really can be a complement to regulation. I think you could have a company, for example, that says, we have evaluated, and they would probably say it in a confidential communication with a customer, we have evaluated our products using these various tools looking for vulnerabilities. Are there any other tools you'd like us to use? And we enter into a contract that when we find a vulnerability, and this is a problem in some of the open source stuff that doesn't happen enough, if we find a vulnerability, we will notify you of the vulnerability, and we'll work with you to come up with a patch. So that contractual provision is something that's not like, oh, we're perfect, that we're doing a warranty. It's we are exercising due diligence, we are communicating, and we'll be held accountable if we don't.
Yeah, The one thing I would say is, and it ties to the sanctions comment as well, is I think that what's going on right now is there is a conversation about the range of incentives and disincentives that can be used to drive behavior. A lot of that has focused on what's been doing that behavior in the operational environment. In other words, how are users managing technology? But there is an emergent conversation about that range of incentives and disincentives. I think one of the things I would agree with Andy on is that neither governments nor industries, and I don't mean ICT industry necessarily, but the customer sets have yet fully explored the range of market incentives that exist. What we're getting to, though, as I highlighted that change in the ecosystem, is a much more complex environment. and you're going to have to really think very carefully about how to scope each one of those incentives and disincentives. I don't believe it's going to be market or regulation. It's probably going to be a combination of procurement incentives, tax liability, maybe basic liability, some regulation. And we have to think very carefully about how to scope each one of those, because if you get the scope wrong, if you go overly broad in the regulatory approach, particularly, for example, in the IoT side, you're going to diminish a series of innovation. Yet at the same time, there are some, for example, IoT environments that are very high-risk life safety systems, for example, where I'm going to kind of want to know that somebody's doing the basic things in terms of managing security across the life cycle, and that if there's a vulnerability that gets found, that there's a way to patch it. But that's the kind of conversation that I think guides like this really help drive, is because this doesn't actually mandate what is the right mechanism by which to promote implementation. What it does help foster is a conversation of what are those kind of outcomes that we should be seeking to drive.
Let me add, I think there's a good example that's taking place in the United States where, and if you pardon the expression, maybe it's the threat of regulation, but in the communications sector, the advisory group, the CISRIC, the Cybersecurity Reliability and Interoperability Council, in 2015 issued guidance that helped give guidance to the 5 subsectors in communications on the use of the NIST cybersecurity framework. Then in 2016, they gave guidance for supply chain risk. So I can see the FCC looking at the players in the communication sector as to whether they're using the due diligence in the analysis of their suppliers that's reflected in that guidance. I think if those folks show that they're actually doing that reasonably, it's unlikely that there would be some kind of a regulatory pressure coming down. But that guidance, working through it, I think is going to help make progress of like-minded buyers to start to require more, and I think that's a good example we can use elsewhere.
Any other comments, questions, concerns, feedback, etc.?
I think it's interesting that technology typically outruns the ability of government to regulate. And that a conversation among buyers or a conversation among sellers can be much more agile than let's publish the proposed regulation, let's have hearings, let's deal with the litigation about whether the process was correct or not. And by that time, there's a whole new environment to be regulated and it's passed us by.
Absolutely right, and I think that, as we suggested here as well, this is a hedge against outdated regulations showing up. This is kind of a self-regulation. It reminds me of the industry norms in that Microsoft recently published about what companies and their government norms also should do in cyberspace and should not do. This is kind of an elaboration of some of the concepts in there into some detail. So to the extent companies step up and police themselves in the marketplace, it's better for everybody. That's right.
I submit the technology half-life
Yeah.
is much shorter than the time required to develop regulation.
Oh,
It's much shorter than the comment period for regulation.
No, it's so true. I mean, law is always a lagging indicator of social agreement, of the social compact, but in this case, it's almost hopeless, yeah.
I think there's a tendency, because of the difficulty, and partly it's what you just said, the difficulty of coming up with regulations that make sense means it's either regulate or do nothing, and there's a tendency to do nothing. And so I think we're trying to start a conversation, and when you look at not just private procurements, but when you look at government procurements, where under President Obama's executive order, there was certainly an attempt to try to come up with procurement requirements, which is, you know, not making the progress that some thought. But if you give preference to those who are doing smart things, that's going to encourage smart things, and you don't have to be as prescriptive in what you spell out.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention and for coming. Let's have a glass of wine and continue the conversation. Thanks so much.